or trying to avoid doing as a people then. The funny thing is, if we get this out of our midst, this accusing, this fault finding and everything like that, then we will have that first scenario where many jets of light were streaming up. And we will see why shortly. See, we are supposed to be those sons of light in Thessalonians, those jets of light. But you see, instead as a people, we have found fault finding as our religion. And that is why we are blinded sometimes to the days that we live in. But God, even though all these things have happened, God is still a gracious God, and He is still leading His people. And I believe there's more to the story that He's given us to show us how to get back onto the right track. But first of all, what light has God given us in His scriptures to show that we are very close to the soon return of Christ? Let's just take a quick look at a few examples. In Matthew 24:7. In Matthew 24:7, it gives us one example. Matthew 24:7 says, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places." Now let's just take a look at the earthquakes, for example. Between the 17 and 1800s, there was 423 recorded earthquakes. Between the 1800s and the 1900s, there was 1,082 earthquakes recorded. Between the 1900s and 2000, there were 2,522 earthquakes recorded. Between the year 2000 and 2008, there have been 518 earthquakes recorded so far. And if that current rate keeps on going, by the 21st century, we will have the same amount of earthquakes that have occurred in the last 500 years. Is that a sign of the times? What about false worship? Well, one of the quotes from Ellen White that she had in a vision was, "The things you have described as taking place in Indiana, the Lord has shown me would take place just before the close of probation. There will be shouting with drums, music, and dancing. The senses of rational beings will become so confused that they cannot be trusted to make right decisions." And does it just say it in her writings? No. The scriptures even confirm the same things. If you study the story of Balaam, which we don't have time to go into now, but you might have heard it before, and you study how the whole scenario is just before Israel crossed into Canaan, the one thing King Balak used was music and rebellion and false worship to lure Israel into the camp. And then into Israel's camp, he lured this false music back in. And how do we know that? We know that because the name Zimri and Cosby, the two perpetrators at the end that God named, if you look at the meaning behind their names mean false music. So not only through Ellen White, it shows us this same thing, which some people debate this is what this means, but also in Scripture it says the same thing. So is that a sign of the times as well? What about the economic crash taking place at the moment? Is that found in Scripture? Well, if anyone looks at Daniel 11:43, in Daniel 11:43, it says, "He shall have power over the treasures of the gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians follow at his heels." Now, once again, I don't have time to go into that, but if you study that, this is right at the end when Rome comes back into power and it takes control of all the wealth of the world. And what's happening now in the world? We're seeing a major economic crisis take place where money is falling everywhere. We haven't seen the effects of this hit us yet, but they're saying next year is going to be the year that it comes down to the local level, you could say, where everyone is going to feel the pinch. And the interesting thing is, from here, if you study it, you can see that the king of the north takes over the gold and the silver again. Do we see Rome doing that same thing these days? A couple of, I think a month or two ago, two politicians were speaking on the news in the morning, and they were speaking about how, like, there's no way that we can escape this economic crisis, that because of our history, it's coming and we've spent too much. And he said, and these two politicians said, the only way for us to free ourselves from this is if we turn to Rome. Is that a sign of the times? What about things like the 2004 tsunami? It's interesting because Minister John McLeod said that it was Sunday breaking that caused the tsunami. What about floods and fires? There were, recently when I was back in Brisbane, there were 3 consecutive storms that hit this one part of Brisbane, this same suburb, over and over again, and absolutely destroyed it. And there were floods, and at the same time, fires were taking place in LA. What do these little things mean? I'll show you in a sec. But a lot of these things were taking place. What about Sunday worship? Are we seeing things like this beginning to take place, where they try to enforce these things? Well, I'll just read this quote out to you. This is also from Spirit of Prophecy. Listen carefully. Our people have been regarded as too insignificant for us to be noticed, but a change will come. The Christian world is now making movements which will necessarily bring commandment-keeping people into prominence. The time is coming when God's people will feel the hand of persecution because they keep holy the 7th day, Saturday. But God's people are to stand firm for Him. Men in responsible positions will not only ignore and despise the Sabbath themselves, but from the sacred desk will urge upon the people the observance of the first day of the week, pleading tradition and custom in behalf of this man-made institution. They will point to calamities on land and sea, to storms of winds and flood, the earthquakes, the destruction by fire, as judgments indicating God's displeasure because Sunday is not sacredly observed. These calamities will increase more and more. One disaster will follow close upon the heels of another. And those who make void the law of God will point to the few who are keeping the Sabbath of the 4th commandment as the ones who are bringing wrath upon the world. The time is not far distant when the test will come to every soul. The observance of the false Sabbath, the national Sunday laws, will be urged upon us. The contest will be between the commandments of God and the commandments of men. See, it's funny. There are a lot of Christians and Seventh-day Adventist Christians out there that are waiting to see some major event take place, something big that will suddenly bring all the world against our people because we worship on the 7th day. But the thing is, it's all these little disasters that Spirit of Prophecy tells us here that will be the thing that calls for Sunday worship. And are we seeing these things take place as we speak? Yes. A couple of weeks ago, in the Zenit magazine, or the Zenit, it's a Catholic website, they wrote, in a related area, the prelates also called for the respect of Sunday rest, an issue that the bishops want included in the working time directive, set for Parliament vote by the middle of next month. This was written in November, so they would have voted on that probably a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. I wonder what happened. Also, a press release from Commerce, another publication by the Catholic Church. In the same spirit, the bishops called for the respect of Sunday rest as one of the foundations of the European social model and as a way of balancing work and family life. In recent years, Sunday as a weekly rest day has been threatened by legislation in many member states, thanks to liberal and consumerist-driven political concepts. In the context of the present economic crisis, the Commerce Bishop calls on the members of the European Parliament to assume their responsibility and include the protection of Sunday in the Working Time Directive that will be submitted to the European Parliament's vote by the middle of December. You see, just like that minister was saying that tsunami it was because of Sunday breaking that caused the tsunami. And we're seeing all these fires happen, and Mrs. White even says that fires in LA would be one